Welcome to the talk, this is an edition of First Floor Live, Mood Machine, the rise of Spotify, and the costs of the perfect playlist. My name is Shawn Reynaldo. I am the person who does First Floor. In case you don't know, it's a newsletter. I live here in Barcelona. I'm a music journalist. I write about the music industry and culture and stuff like that. But the main reason you're probably here, the main reason I'm here is because I'm going to be talking to Liz Pelly, who wrote the book in the title of today's talk. So, Liz, thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you for having me. And yeah, thanks to Primavera and everyone involved in making this happen.
So, your book came out in January, and I know that you have done dozens of talks like this one since then. And I'm just curious, doing all these talks, answering all these questions from people like me and from audience members, have you figured out how to fix streaming yet?
Not me. I think one of the things about doing events in person that has been exciting has been the opportunity to talk to other people and hear from, people who come to listen and conversations with artists and people who run independent record labels after the events and, uh, scheming. The scheming that happens after the events has been kind of like my favorite part.
When people ask or talk about fixing streaming, do you even think that that is an appropriate framing of how we should be looking at the situation?
Until really recently, I wasn't thinking of it in these terms, but some of the, broader political organizations that I'm like plugged in with talk about an inside outside strategy where you're working within inside the system and outside the system at the same time. And I actually realized that that's kind of similar to the response that I usually give. I also have heard people who work in broader cultural organizing spheres talk about it as like resisting and building at the same time. It's like you kind of have to do both. And I actually think that I don't think it's possible to really talk about improving the situation for artists or making the music business less exploitative for artists without talking about both like how you uh, make things better from the inside and also build alternative structures. So, like, supporting the artists and organizations that are fighting for regulation and that are trying to, I don't know, struggle to even say, like, make streaming more fair, but definitely make it less exploitative. So, like, figuring out new ways of getting royalties to artists, figuring out ways you could use regulation to minimize digital payola, or make it more transparent, thinking about, like, the many deceptive practices that streaming services are engaged in and the harms to not just artists, but listeners and users of platforms, like, thinking about every lever of power that's possible in regulating while also realizing that, like, okay, if we actually are thinking about artist fairness, like, that's always going to involve thinking about ground up alternative structures outside the corporate music business. Like, it has to be both, I think.
Since the book has come out, I imagine people come up to you and want to talk about Spotify on a regular basis. And what things from the book or what aspects of Spotify do people want to talk to you about the most? Or what issue do you feel like resonated the most with people?
And people are always apologizing too, and I'm like, "You don't have to apologize. I wrote a book about the subject." Like, I'm obviously down to talk about it. Um, yeah, it depends. I mean, I do think that for, certain readers, the sort of, political and economic dimensions of it are really urgent. Like, a lot of people really wanna talk about the material realities of artists' lives. A certain type of reader really wants to talk about, how hard it has become for musicians to make a living or maybe even how hard it's always been, and maybe for some, it's, like, revealed in a new way. And then I mean, in terms of, like, media interviews, definitely the thing that I've been asked about the most is, like, Explain what fake artists is." That and, like, talking about that. But I think it makes sense because although, like, in my reporting in the book, talk about this very specific instance of, what's essentially stock music being used to populate instrumental playlists, and it has this very specific impact on a certain type of artist. I think that right now it has a lot of broader implications in this moment where a lot of people are concerned about generative AI music and like what the impact of generative AI music is going to be on streaming and on artists. And, something I get a lot now is people emailing me, strangers who I don't know, emailing me a link to a track on Spotify and saying, "Can you tell me if this is AI?" And I'm like, "I could try." A lot of times it's like, yeah, it seems like it definitely is, actually.
What are the telltale signs with your expert ears?
Oh, I think oftentimes it's like the artist name, the album art clearly being something made with generative AI, or and also looking at the other types of material that they have released. It's often like quite similar, really simple, not having a profile off any platforms. And then also if you look at the playlists that they're on, if it's all these kind of like clear, like spammy, like pay to play, like, yeah, I feel like it's kind of like a mix of things.
I mean, I think one reason that the whole fake artists thing, well, I think there's 2 reasons that it really resonated. One, that was the main topic of the excerpt of the book that was published before the book came out, and we all know people are bad about buying things, but they'll read the free article online. But I also think because you unearthed that it has this, like, very corporate, kind of depressing name, Perfect Fit Content, how did you, I mean, as much as you can reveal, like, how did you come across this? Because that had never been reported previously anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, the reporting process for the book was pretty robust. It involved interviewing over 100 sources. Those sources were a lot of musicians, people who work in the music business, people who used to work in the music business, and a lot of former Spotify employees. So the mix of all of those sources was important. And then, yeah, the book also draws on reference to review of internal records and Slack messages. And it was really just like an ongoing years long process of excavation. But yeah, it's really hard to get people in the music business to talk to you about stuff like this. It's really hard to specifically get people who worked at streaming services to talk to you about this sort of stuff. I think one of the biggest issues that artists and people trying to advocate on the behalf of artists remains just the fact that so much information about streaming services remains like locked up by NDAs, by beyond even just NDAs, also just kind of like a culture of secrecy. One thing that has been really cool to observe over the past decade ish of writing about this subject is that at the beginning, it was really hard to get artists to talk publicly about their experiences with streaming and Spotify in particular because they were worried about retaliation. They were worried about getting removed from playlists. They were worried that, and fair enough for some of these artists, it's remains although they should be getting paid much more, it still remains like a meaningful revenue stream for how they're able to pay their bills. Um, Over time, I think it's changed. I think a lot more musicians, I mean, yeah, many more musicians are willing to be honest about this stuff now, especially artists who have gotten involved in collective organizing projects, musicians unions, and solidarity efforts who I think have understood that there is more power in having a collective voice, than that is worth more than maybe like the penny fractions that they'd lose out on for not being added to like indie chill, hanging out with your friends morning mix or whatever.
What was the vibe like of the former Spotify employees that you talked to? Were these people like, did they feel guilty about what they'd done and they were trying to like make themselves clean by telling you what had been going on? Or, yeah, I'm just curious, like, what their motivations were.
Total range of perspectives, to be, totally honest. I mean, I felt that it was important to try to talk to some people who had really good experiences working these companies too, or, like, thought they had the coolest job in the world, because that's, like, an interesting perspective as well. Um, but, yeah, I think that by and large, like, uh, a lot of the people who I spoke with, Spotify employee or former employee, people who work in the music business, um, yeah, I think a lot of people who work in the music industry recognize the shortfallings of this model, not even just Spotify, but like the streaming model in general. And that's something that was really interesting too, is like, you know, I think from my perspective, I assume that a lot of people, no offense, but I assume that a lot of people who work in the music industry are kind of like apathetic about this stuff or like kind of resigned or just sort of like, well, this is just the way it is. But yeah, I learned that there actually are a lot of people who are working inside the system who recognize like the mistakes of their employers.
I mean, you've been even before the book came out, you spent years writing about Spotify and streaming, services and how they're affecting music culture. How hard has it been for or how much resistance have you found because of this narrative that Spotify saved the music industry? Because I feel like that was kind of the dominant narrative in the music press, like, piracy was destroying everything, and then Spotify came along and, found a way to make the internet and music happy together. Do you feel like that narrative is still in place for a lot of people, and is that something you've had to push back against in your own work?
I think that it's really depends on who you're talking to, streaming returns the global recorded music industry to growth. Like, you can't really question that, like, it's true, but it's like, what does that mean? Like, growth for who? Like, profit for who? If you talk to someone who works at a major label, like, yeah, obviously, like, major labels have made a ton of money. In the course of this, 1-hour interview, major labels will have made millions of dollars from streaming services, like, while we're sitting here, like, like, they're doing great. But if you talk to uh, independent record label owners, artists working with independent record labels, musicians who don't make commercial music, and by that I mean like pop music that aspires towards mainstream success, or music that has that lends itself towards replays, infinite replays, music that you put on in the background while doing something else. There's certain types of music that for whom like this model works better. And then, yeah, I don't think that there's very much convincing that you need to do anymore with working artists, working with independent record labels who make more like, experimental music or anything that's like not commercial, like, yes, I think that the message has landed.
I've found as someone who's also spent some time, like, analyzing and critiquing streaming services in my work, I find that when I do get pushback, it's often in a vein of like, "Oh, you're just being a naysayer. You're stuck in a model from the '90s that doesn't exist anymore." And if you look at music, the music industry is more profitable than ever. There's no shortage of good music being released. Um, how do you square that, with how can are our critiques of streaming fair when there are all these people making money and there is still a lot of great music coming out?
It's like it's incredibly hard to make a living as a musician, and, like, I feel like it would be so dishonest as someone who's immersed in a music scene and a music community that has tons of friends who make incredible music, who are very dedicated musicians, who it's like their life's work, and a lot of people really enjoy their music. People come to their shows, people buy their records, and they're still struggling. So to see, like, the lived experience of so many musicians continue to be so hard and become harder and harder every year, and to not want to report about the systems that, create the conditions for that difficulty that they experience every day would be so dishonest, I think. Like, I feel like there's one approach to it where you could like look at the numbers, but like look at people and their lives, and they're very hard. And it's not just musicians, um, but yeah, that's kind of what I've always like, the work that I do has always been rooted in interviews with musicians. It's always been rooted in, like, wanting to actually talk directly with artists, and, I think of that, increasingly as having a kind of pro-labor perspective on music business reporting, is talking to workers, talking to people who are the ones who are, like, powering this whole industry, who make all of this possible is the people who make music, and without centering those experiences, like, the numbers don't really like, I don't numbers don't really mean a lot to me if you're not also talking to people and asking them how they're faring in the economy.
One thing from the book that really jumped out to me is you kind of point out how Spotify co-opted the word independent. And, I think in the traditional sense of the word, when people think about independent music culture, they're talking about local music scenes. They're almost talking more about, to steal a term from Matt Dryhurst, who's not here, interdependence, where it's like these communities of people sort of feeding off and supporting one another. But can you explain a little bit about what independence has come to mean within the Spotify ecosystem?
Mhm. Yeah, so there's the chapter of my book called Indie Vibes, and, um, Actually, the name of the chapter is I teach undergraduates in a recorded music program, and a few years ago, I taught a class called "What is Indie?" question mark, because I found that a lot of the students in the program, I just, like elsewhere in the world in the industry, I heard a lot of people using the word indie to mean something sonic, like to talk about the way a certain record sounded, and to me, the word has always been shorthand for independent, meaning independent from the 3 major record labels. So I was thought it'd be interesting to do a class that kind of unpacks, like, what has this word meant historically? What does it evoke in the popular imagination? And, like, how is that changing? How has it changed? And, yeah, that's obviously a word that has been completely hollowed out to the point of, like, utter meaninglessness. But it's interesting thinking historically about, like, what independence has meant and, like, why it continues to carry so much weight for so many people who work in music. Um, I do think though that it's, like, beyond past the point of needing new frameworks for thinking about interrogating power in culture. It obviously is, like, not really an effective shorthand when you have so many different definitions for what the word means. Um and yeah, but in the context of the book, I think I was just like sort of, it's not specific. Spotify is not the only entity within the music industry who have kind of like used this word to try to evoke just like a sense of like individualism and kind of I talk about it in the book as kind of like a way of sort of just marketing certain types of playlists that are targeted towards certain types of like Gen Z users and kind of I think I talk about it in a similar breath to like these playlists that are like my life is a movie or something. And like, it's about like making people feel like individuals more than like actually saying anything about the independence of the music itself.
I mean, that's one thing that's really interesting about streaming is it has this almost like, I mean, this is probably strong language, but like solidarity busting effect where it flattens the landscape and everyone is competing against each other, where it doesn't matter if you're Merzbow or Beyonce or a local band that just started, you're basically on the same platform, dealing with the same rules and the same challenges. How do you feel like that has affected music culture and especially like independent music culture?
Yeah, I definitely, I think there's a quote in my book from Greg Saunier from Deerhoof, where he's talking about how, like, yeah, the idea of the level playing field was presented as like this gift, like, oh, and you, like the DIY musician from a small town, are going to be on a level playing field with Beyonce. Like, it was like, this opportunity, but actually, another way of looking at it is that you have no choice. And actually, as an independent artist without the resources and backing and marketing muscle of a major record label are now like, forced to compete in the same platforms and the same economic logics and the same playlist ecosystem and marketing ecosystem as these artists that have all of this marketing muscle behind them. Like, you know, I don't know if it's true that like streaming services have any sort of quota where they have to, you know, promote major label artists. I'm often told it's not true, but what we do know is that those labels have way more resources in terms of marketing. Those people have more direct lines of communications with people who are playlist curators. They're essentially like partners in the business. So obviously, they also would be uh, thinking about their responsibility to these labels and promotion. Also, most independent artists don't have that, so it's never really like a level playing field.
I mean, one issue where resources come in is discovery mode on Spotify. Maybe you could talk just a little bit about what that is and what the financial component of it is?
Yeah, so there is a chapter in my book about payola-like practices in the streaming era, and payola-like practices currently on streaming certainly aren't limited to discovery mode, but I think it's like a really in important example to dissect and think about what it means for musicians. So Discovery Mode is this program that Spotify runs where artists can agree to accept a 30% royalty reduction in exchange for algorithmic promotion. It's a type of algorithmic promotion technology. That's what they call it. And it's, yeah, different from payola because payola, the phrase used in the radio era. It's outlawed, at least in the United States. I'm actually not sure what the local laws are here around payola. But, it's imagine this image of, like, a radio promoter, like, sneaking an envelope of cash into, like, a radio station in exchange for airplay. It's like money changing hands in exchange for radio play. That's illegal. But with programs like discovery mode, it's actually, like, happening in the open. It's part of the business model. It's not, like, considered to be this, like, controversial exploitative practice. It's just like, "Oh, no, yeah, this is just part of how we make money is artists take lower royalty rates, and we promote them more algorithmically on Daily Mix, radio, and, a couple other places. Autoplay is the other place." Um, and I think something to me that I think is super concerning, not only concerning about it, but something that I think probably no matter what your position, on streaming is, you'd agree, is that there's this connection between, like, the ghost artist stuff and the PFC program and the discovery mode stuff, which is that in both instances, if you're a user of Spotify, you could open this app, you could be recommended a track, and you're being recommended it due to some sort of pre-existing commercial deal, um, like, th and not know, not have no idea because it's not marked. And I think that we're at a point right now where it's really important to start having conversations about the importance of that being disclosed to the user, and that being considered deceptive practice to not disclose when something is being recommended because the artist is getting paid less or the streaming service is getting paid more. That should be labeled in some way as sponsored, as, part of a specific discovery program. And I think also it'd be helpful as more, there's tens of thousands of generative AI tracks added to these platforms every day. But as streaming services navigate, how they're going to be using generative AI music in ways that could potentially be affecting artists' abilities to make livings on these platforms, there's no reason to believe they're not going to. Like, streaming services wants to figure out ways to provide content to the lowest cost to them. And generative AI surely already is providing a way of doing that, or if not already, will in the future be providing a way of doing that. And users should know if they're, like, being pushed generative AI tracks. So it kind of has, I think, interesting precedent to talk about the instances already on platforms where people are being shown tracks due to these commercial deals and not having it labeled.
Another thing about discovery mode, at least that jumped out to me, is it seems like it's destined to sort of foster a race to the bottom because the more people that start using it to break through and get their music featured, the less of an effect it will have. And then so it'll create more pressure to use it on other tracks and hope. And it seems like it's just the artists that end up losing.
Yeah, I that's a concern that pretty much everyone I interviewed for my book about discovery mode had. It was like, what's the point of saturation? Is this even, like, providing any value to us if everyone's enrolling in a program like this? The phrase "race to the bottom" came up many times in my interviews. And I think that's legit, especially, like, when, the success of the program internally is being viewed as, like, how many artists can we get on board? That was something that was super interesting revelation of the reporting as well.
I mean, another thing where resources come in is the fact that Spotify is not a platform where an individual artist can just go log in and upload their music themselves. You have to go through a digital distributor, and you usually have to pay for that either upfront or on the back end or anything like that. Do you think that we could be heading towards a system where, like, Spotify itself, I mean, that's like a pay to play element that already exists. Do you think, like, we could get to a point where Spotify itself is gonna start charging artists to have their music on the platform?
Maybe, I try to not, like, speculate about what a company like Spotify might or might not do because I truly don't know. If there's is anyone from Spotify here? It's worth asking. I'm like, maybe they would know. I don't know. Um, yeah, so I'm not sure, but I wouldn't be surprised because I think that not just streaming services, but I think major labels too right now are really concerned with, like, eliminating the work of what they call, like, hobbyists and amateurs from their royalty pool that, in their eyes, is dedicated only for serious musicians that make good music that people actually wanna listen to, which is obviously not the work of hobbyists and amateurs and DIY musicians. So I wouldn't be surprised.
I mean, your book has obviously gotten a lot of attention, but even before it came out, there's been like no shortage of Spotify is bad press, Spotify is problematic. Um, it's not really like a secret anymore, at least for anyone who's been halfway.
I can't believe anyone still wants to talk about this.
Yeah.
I'm glad.
So given that, where it's, like, pretty common knowledge that this is an exploitative company, why is it still so popular, do you think? I mean, Spotify just last year had it, like, I think its first profitable year ever. Their user base is higher than it's ever been. Why is it so successful and popular when people know that it's kind of this, like, evil corporation or whatever you wanna describe it?
I think I mean, it's an incredible value to the consumer to get most of what you could imagine as a history of popular recorded music for $11 a month, like, I don't think that's in question either. It's a good deal. Um, and I also think the free tier also, like, attracts a lot of people too. And it's complicated because yeah, like, I am in favor of universal access to music. Like, I don't think that that is a bad thing. I think that, like, um, people should be able to access the music that they wanna listen to. Like, I think, there's other ways of imagining what that could look like that I think are more interesting and appealing and, culturally less harmful. But it's not hard to see why so many people stream music. I think, there's a lot of novelty to the whole concept, too. Uh, yeah, and I also just think there's, like, a sense of resignation that people have, most it's kind of like, why do people buy really cheap clothes when they know that it's bad for the environment and bad for workers and, bad for the world in general. Like, I think there's a sense of resignation. People are like, well, me stopping using the streaming service isn't going to change anything. But more and more, especially in like independent music communities, in DIY scenes, I do see, a change of attitude. Like, I just did an interview a couple days ago for my new podcast with Andy Cush, from Hearing Things. She wrote this article that was about just like independent musicians and independent record labels divesting from streaming services. And, he spoke to a range of artists and labels about, um, yeah, just, moving off of streaming services. And I think that you do see more of that. Another example I point to often is the jazz label International Anthem that, has stopped putting their music on streaming services on the day it comes out. So, like, they have now a release day for Bandcamp and vinyl, and then, like, a couple months later, they put their music on streaming, and I think that that's, like, an interesting example too of, just music communities and scenes, like, evaluating the situation, acknowledging that what works best for their artists and the types of people that support their artists is, when people buy the record directly, and then trying to reshape the album cycle in a way that prioritizes the things that actually benefit their artists. Yeah, I think there's like some different examples of some people who are sort of pushing beyond the feeling of total resignation.
Speaking of resignation, I've found, especially with younger artists who've pretty much just grown up with streaming their whole life, there is like sort of a normalization of the idea that artists shouldn't necessarily be making money from their music directly. Like, that's not how you make money. You make money by selling merch, you make money by touring and stuff like that. Do you think that idea of like making music and selling it to consumers or getting money directly is that you know, going extinct? Is it lost forever, or do you think it can be reclaimed?
I don't think it's going extinct. I think it really just speaks to the reality of how different music scenes are, because in the music communities that I'm part of and the artists that I talk to, I definitely, don't have a sense of that. I feel like there is, like, a really strong sense, especially, like, um, since I remember at the start of the pandemic, I feel like there was like this really big grappling with like, if you really care about artists, you should buy their music directly from them. Obviously could have a whole other conversation about Bandcamp, but like the surge of Bandcamp Fridays and stuff, and people like, and I think you've written about Bandcamp Fridays before too, so check that out for the extra perspective. Um, but this kind of just like more broader cultural sensibility that buying music directly from people is important, I think also is pretty strong amongst a certain corners of independent music for sure.
Do you think part of the reason that, we haven't come up with, like, a lot of viable let me say, scalable, viable alternatives is because people are waiting for sort of a one-size-fits-all alternative to Spotify and maybe the answer is, we need 100 alternatives to Spotify, not just one?
Mhm. Yeah, I I definitely right now there are so many people who are working on alternatives to Bandcamp, which is interesting and, I think generally exciting that there are all of these different cooperative, artist-run projects bubbling up, so things like Tone.audio, Subvert FM, there's one called Merlot, there's, like, you can join their Discords and check out their in the case of Tone.audio, you can, like, check out their GitHub and, like, see all this join their Discord, like, there's kind of, like, um, a bunch of different examples of these groups of, in some cases, artists, and in some cases, people who have deep roots in the music world, just trying to kind of, like, encourage these cooperative alternatives, and that's cool. But, yeah, I definitely have gotten the question a lot of, like, okay, those projects seem like they'll be really good for people who are interested in, like interested in cooperatives, but or interested in, more niche music scenes, DIY music, underground music, but, what's there's still the type of person who is like, "What's the one app I can go to?" I've been talking because my book ends the solutions that I point to towards the end of my book are talking about artist-run cooperatives, public funding for the arts, like public libraries running streaming services, and I think there is a certain type of, consumer that wanted the, like, "press here for ethical consumerism" button, and, like, that's obviously, like, not exactly, um, a solution, that you can and certainly not a solution you can point anyone to right now. Um, so, yeah, I think that there is kind of like, uh at present, it's Bandcamp, like, that's kind of the best we've got, I'd say.
It's interesting though because even Bandcamp has
Yeah,
been sold twice in the past
exactly.
few years and is now owned by a corporation that no one really knows what their real motives are.
Yeah. I think that's why in some ways, like, the search for a Bandcamp alternative in certain music scenes feels, like, even more urgent than maybe, like, the search for a Spotify that pays artists better or something, and just a wrap around to the beginning of the conversation, that's also kind of why I feel like the inside outside approach is necessary in some ways.
This is a total fantasy scenario, but let's say tomorrow you get a call from Daniel Ek and he's like, "Come here, I'm gonna put you in charge of Spotify for one day." What would you do to alter the company, or, how they run?
I definitely would not do that. Like, yeah, where you um, yeah, not a situation I think I'd ever find myself in, but I think, um, I'm a big fan of, like, listening to artists, so, at some ongoing campaigns, like the UMA Justice at Spotify campaign has pretty specific demands for penny per stream, user-centric payment model, making contracts transparent, crediting all labor and ending payola. So, like, I think that I probably would hand the responsibility over to Yuma and just point to their list of demands is what I would do. Then also I know there's like specific demands that the UK Musicians Union. I'm not sure if there's any like musicians unions or solidarity organizations based in Spain that have done similar campaigns. But I probably would point into the direction of what musicians unions have been asking for. Oh, actually, I probably would just like go. try to get copies of the contracts with the major labels. I'd probably specifically try to get a copy of Spotify's contract with the Universal Music Group, and I'd post it online. That's what I would do if I was CEO for a day.
I mean, you've mentioned UMA and labor organizations several times. Um, why do you think that labor organizing is not more of a widespread thing amongst musicians? Like, why is it so challenging to get musicians to work together collectively?
Well, I'm sorry for a United States perspective, but where where I live in the United States, it is illegal for independent musicians to organize without risking legally being deemed an illegal cartel, because independent musicians are independent contractors, and independent contractors, it's like, considered a sort of like conspiratorial, like, action again to organize a sector or whatever. Um, so yeah, in the United States, at least, it's really hard because independent contractors, like, can't form unions. So most of the groups I've been referencing, like UMA, for example, is actually just like a solidarity organization. They're not technically a trade union. So that's part of it. But then I think another part of it is just that music is so vast, and I think there's a lot of artists who come from different backgrounds, who have different ideas about, how they relate to music, and I think it could be hard to, like, sort of convince musicians who come from different scenes and backgrounds that they have more in common with each other than maybe they'd realize. I like to remind people that the definition of the word solidarity involves working together across differences, not just working together with people who already see things exactly the way you do. And I think that that's something that's important for people trying to organize musicians to realize, but there have been, I think, some really successful campaigns that groups like Yuma have been able to achieve through organizing musicians and being specifically, like, attuned to the lived realities of musicians' lives and, like, the specific ways that you can effectively organize artists, which is kind of different than maybe ways that you would organize other workers, but also a lot in common with other attempts to organize freelancers, organize people across the gig economy. It's not like, in some ways, because the whole economy has become so freelance and there's so much reliance on gig labor, and at least in the United States, like, there's very few people, like, I think, like, the number is in my book, actually, how many people in the United States are members of unions, but I think it's, like, less than 15% of the United States belongs to a union. Um, in some ways, like, the broader efforts to organize the freelance sector, like, share some sort of goals and experiences with the attempts to organize musicians.
When you were researching the book, I mean, you talked to over 100 people, you said, did you at any point talk or even attempt to talk to someone at Spotify just to be like, hey, I noticed all these things you're doing. Can you explain?
Um, Not for my book, but for the Harper's excerpt, yeah, there was a process of, like, communication with the company for the Harper's excerpt, and there's, like, a box, like, in the article that has, their response, and same thing with my excerpt. Another excerpt from my book was excerpted in The Guardian, and there was communication with the company, for that as well, but, with the book itself, I've said this before, but it's true. I 90,000 words seems like a lot, but actually it's not that long, and I wanted to write a ground up story. Like, I wanted to write a story that was really rooted in the experiences of how the streaming model and practices of a company like Spotify have impacted musicians, have impacted people who run independent record labels. The perspective of Spotify, the perspective of their top executives has been told, like, really comprehensively by them. They have a podcast where they, tell their whole corporate version of the story of the company. So I reference that. I've spent so much time listening to media interviews, from their CEO and their top executives. I also, there's another book that came out a few years ago called The Spotify Play, that is a really, it's a different type of of narrative, but it is really robustly reported, sort of like biography of Spotify as a company, also Spotify Teardown, another book that and, this is all towards the back of the book, I have, like, a note on sources where I sort of explain what I drew from, and those sources were all really helpful in putting the book together, but, when they were writing Spotify Teardown, the company also, like, tried to take legal action against them to get them to not publish the book, so it's, kind of also part of the context within which this book existed too, the reporting of it.
Those, statements from, like, their executives and CEO, if I'm not mistaken, were a lot of those from, like, the earlier days of the company?
Both, yeah. I mean, I definitely drew on some early interviews, early conference appearances. Something that was super interesting about reporting this book. It's a company that was founded in 2006, launched in Europe in 2008, launched in the United States in 2011, and also launched around 2006, 2007 was YouTube. And there's actually like a lot of really early interviews and early conference appearances with their co-founders and early employees that I was able to find on YouTube that were super helpful. And then I also but, through to the months where I was doing the last edits on the manuscript, I was listening to media appearances that Daniel Ek and Gustav Soderstrom were doing and drawing on those as well it's kind of like with a book like this, try to write it as evergreen as possible, but there was interesting stuff ha happening that seemed noteworthy, like, even in the months when I was finishing the book too. So I try to make it as current as possible, but also realize that there's always gonna be some weird new thing that Daniel Ek has said in an interview.
I mean, the reason I asked about that timeline is because I know he's still like, Daniel Ek, for instance, still makes these, like, occasional media appearances, but they're always these very safe, venues for the most part, and, he's not usually facing hard questions, or if they are hard questions, they're ones that he's been, like, coached in advance to have an answer. Like, um, do you think that they're, like, purposely sort of, like, avoiding real scrutiny in the media?
Yeah. Definitely. Um,
And how do they get away with that? Like, given the level of outcry, it's kind of wild how much Daniel Ek has been able to, like, not been forced to sit down with real journalists and ask questions and answer questions.
yeah. Well, I also think it's like, kinda on the music business press too, because actually people from Spotify do a lot of interviews, but, they don't always get asked a lot of hard questions in those interviews.
I mean, that also is it's interesting as well because, like, a lot of these, music media outlets or publications, they also will have deals with Spotify, or Spotify will advertise on their platforms, or they'll do playlists on Spotify to highlight their content. So, do you feel like the music media is a bit compromised when it comes to covering this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of interesting. Like it's interesting parallels the music business press with like the music press in general because something you hear a lot as just like, I would consider myself my background to be more in like the normal world of music journalism where we do interviews with bands and reviews and in the music journalism press like it's really hard to get access to high profile people to do interviews so like you're always sort of like navigating like the politics of access and I'd imagine that music business outlets are also navigating the weird politics of access also where like you want to report on these companies but you also want to make sure that they're going to be making themselves available to you giving you scoops giving you interviews with interesting people maybe coming to your conference doing a panel getting people to buy tickets to your conference like that kind of thing so in some ways it's like kind of makes sense that they would want to like make sure that they are reporting and doing just enough that they wouldn't like totally, um, you know, cut ties or, offend someone.
Do you think part of the issue is also that, like, talking about the mechanics of streaming can be extremely complicated? And, I've tried to explain what a user-centric payment model is in my work so many times, and it's like I can never do it in less than, like, 2 or 3 paragraphs, and even then I feel like it's not that clear. So it's like, it seems like there's a hurdle in just communicating how this stuff works to the general public who's just putting on a playlist while they cook dinner.
Yeah, and that's the reason why the chapter in my book explaining streaming economics is chapter 13 and not chapter 1, because actually if it were up to me, like well, it was up to me. There's part of me that thinks that the financial realities and the sort of economic dimensions of this information about how streaming impacts the material realities of artists' lives like should be what is foregrounded, what is like the opening of this conversation. But I also know that streaming economics are so confusing and boring that if you opened a book about Spotify explaining like how the pro rata business model works, like no one is going to read that book. And they won't get to these other really important subjects and perspectives from all the people you've interviewed. So you kind of have to, figure out a way to make it interesting, and maybe it's like outlining some of the stakes before you get there. But yeah, definitely think that's part of it. And I will say also, like, I should say, I just earlier said a couple of things about like the music business press. I also do like really, while writing this book, I was also really grateful for a lot of the day to day reporting of the music business press, because, if you look through the notes and the works, the bibliography of this book, it's like so much of that work helps make it possible for people who are doing more critical stuff to like have these sources to look back to. And I do really value that work from that perspective too. And also do feel like there's I'm thinking of when the excerpt from my book came out, Ted Gioia did this newsletter where he was like, yeah, I tried pitching this story about fake artists on Spotify to so many outlets, to all the big music publications, to all these big newspapers, and no one wanted to cover this. And like, why didn't anyone take this story seriously? Like, it took like a independent journalist, like, pursuing it themselves to like get the scoop on this. And I do think that it also speaks to like, I do think that wish that there was more of a willingness to of the general music publications and newspapers, media outlets to like invest in investigative music journalism, but it's kind of sometimes can be a hard sell.
It doesn't feel like the music press these days has a real, like, muckraking spirit, so to speak. It's more like protect the brand. Like, it's like we're all in the same brand of presenting music as this glamorous product, and no one wants to rock the boat. I mean, this is me editorializing now, but,
Yeah, no, that seems fair. Yeah.
um, I asked you earlier what people ask you the most about in the book, but I'm curious, was there some aspect of the book that you expected people to be shocked by that people just haven't really mentioned that much to you? Like, or something that really sticks in your craw that people haven't seemed to have caught on?
Is there anything that people haven't really um yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the book is rooted in these 2, like, major investigations into PFC and discovery mode, and people have definitely wanted to talk about those a lot. So for the most part, I mean, and also I've been really, really pleasantly surprised by how many conversations I have where people are really excited to talk about the conclusion because, um, I have often said that the conclusion and the chapter on music labor is, from my perspective, the book's, like, reason for existing. If it didn't end on a conclusion that was pointing in the direction of what I think would be some ideas for a healthier independent music world, it wouldn't feel worth writing to me. So I'm really grateful that a lot of people have been really interested in that part of the book too and that conversation. But yeah, there I think there's some aspects of the chapter on payola like practices that I was surprised people don't talk about. Actually, the labor chapter ends with some reporting on Spotify squashing the efforts of their Swedish engineers to organize a union at their office there, and I barely ever get asked about that in interviews, and I thought that was like pretty interesting. They were like, because when we talk about Spotify as like not being a pro labor company or being like an anti union company, you often think about it in terms of their relationship to musicians. But I thought it was really interesting to learn that even internally at the company, that they're also really antagonistic to these efforts to for their engineers were trying to, like, wage a campaign for to reach a collective agreement, which Sweden has its own labor model that, um, is different from the labor model that I'm used to, in the US, but, yeah, they distributed all this kind of, like, anti-union propaganda around the office, and it was just interesting getting to talk to some, people who were involved in that and to hear that other side of Spotify as a, anti-union company.
Personally, I'm someone who's been very interested in the streaming topic. I've written a lot about it. So when your book came out, I was like very eager to read it. But even then, while I was reading it, I kept having to like take breaks every few chapters just because I found it so infuriating. Like every new chapter is like a new disgusting business practice that's happening at Spotify. You've been on this beat for almost a decade now. Like, how do you what keeps you going and not just, like, throw your hands up and be like, "This is disgusting, I need to focus on something else."
Yeah, because I definitely think that's a great question because it's different. Everyone always wants to know, like, why did you first start writing about this subject? And I think that the reasons that I wanted to first start writing about it are totally different than like what keeps you going. And I think in some ways was, it's been like seeing the writing and reporting be useful to musicians. And also in some ways, like, I do think that it wouldn't be fair to say that music journalism outlets don't cover streaming because there's been a lot of great writing that has come out of that front and other writers who have kind of like taken up the beat as well. But I also do think that there's like a specific kind of pro labor perspective that, yeah, just like knowing how few people also are kind of wanting to write about the subject, which I also like kind of get because sometimes it can be kind of depressing. And I can understand why it's not super interesting to a lot of people who it's like you get into music writing because you want to write about records and you want to write about art and you want to talk to cool, interesting people about their music, and you want to critique art, not business. So I also like get why people would not necessarily music journalists would not necessarily find it like super interesting. So yeah, I think part of it has been just like seeing the writing be interesting to artists and important or whatever, hearing people say that is helpful to them in some way. Sorry, not me saying my own writing is important, hearing other people say it was important to them. um, yeah.
Alright. I'm not sure if I was supposed to open this up to the audience, but we're almost out of time anyway, so I'm just gonna ask you one last question. Sorry, everybody. Um,
I can take questions and regularly if anyone has them.
I should have asked ahead of time. But anyways, if people want to do something to improve the streaming situation or just have a healthier relationship with it, like where would you recommend that they start? Like if someone's just sort of waking up or just got to a point where they're like, "You know what? I don't want to engage with Spotify or I don't want to engage with streaming in the same way that I have been."
I have a lot of those conversations with people, and it really depends on like who the person is and like, what kind of music they're into and what their level of interest or commitment to helping either build alternatives or, how I feel like oftentimes when I'm having a conversation with someone about that, it's like, do they seem like someone who would build an MP3 library? And if they don't seem like someone who would build an MP3 library, and a lot of people do, because there is a certain type of person where the answer to that question is like, oh yeah, like I recommend like deleting your streaming service, buying MP3s, and building your own digital collection. And some people are really, really invested in that. And I've actually some people go even way harder than me because I have an MP3 library, but I've learned all about all sorts of different things people are doing, like building their own like home servers. They have their own like streaming apps on their phone where they're streaming music from a server that they have like hosted locally in their own home with all files that they have purchased or, you know, found some other way. Um, or, sometimes I'll say like, well, if you find that streaming is something that you find useful for like listening to new records or listening to old music, but you also can, a few times a month buy a record directly from someone that is a record that you really like, artists where it's clear that buying the record directly from them will make an impact on their lives, then you should, do that. But sometimes the answer is like, maybe you're a musician. Maybe you are now like tapped into an ongoing having conversation about creative labor and you want to get involved in, organizing. Like, I think that musicians getting involved in organizing efforts, whether it be like musicians unions or musicians organizing, or like, maybe you just it's real making you realize that there's like a cost of living crisis more broadly and like you want to get involved in some sort of organizing effort that like, at least coming from the United States, again, like, less familiar here, but, like, being involved in, like, a fight for, uh, affordable housing, universal health care, or, like, public education are all things that impact musicians and that would make their lives easier and better too, so they're all kind of places where the conversation could end too. So yeah, it really just depends. Also, for some people, it's like getting involved in commercial radio. I'm sorry, getting involved in community radio. Um, uh, yeah.
All right. Well, if you want more of Liz's thoughts, you can track down a copy of her book. It's been out for a little while now. Mood Machine, The Rise of Spotify and the Costs of the Perfect Playlist. Liz, thank you so much for coming today and chatting.
Thanks so much for the questions. Thanks for all of your